So let's start with this whole question of organization work. So you've read the chapters. I want to just go over this relatively quickly. Tom is going to be watching the chat, so you can ask any questions anytime. He'll be jumping in to answer some of the either to ask me the question or to answer the question hopefully himself. I'm sure if it's an impossible question, he'll just get me to try to do it, which is fine. Otherwise, he'll answer it himself. So feel free to put your questions in the chat at any point. And we'll just try to go quickly over what we think are the most critical points that hopefully you got from the book, but also give you a chance to ask some questions and get in things a bit deeper. So organization work. We've already talked about self-work. We have these three different categories or types of work. And in the book, if you read the two chapters assigned for today, you'll have read a chapter about organization work. And then we have a chapter where we summarize some of the existing research. The three kinds or the three examples that we use, the three types of organization work are, of course, not the most important or it's just the ones that are kind of more developed and that exist. There's many, many kinds of organization work, of course. Another thing is that, there we go. So Sergio, good question. That's actually what I was about to talk about. We on this page, we have them arranged in a particular order. We don't think about them as levels, right? They're not levels. They're different categories of institutional work. Sorry, different categories of social symbolic work. They're not levels of analysis in the sense of one being above the other, or even that forms of. And what we're trying to get away from is any sense that there's some lower levels that, when they're summed together, equal some higher levels. What they are is there are different types of work that are focused on different parts of social reality, right? So the self is a very important constellation of things that we work on. Organizations are another kind of object, and when there's lots of kinds of work sort of done around organizations, and then the broad societal kind of categories and words and understandings that we have is another area where there's lots of social symbolic work, but they're not inside each other or below or above. It's really just these different categories because of the different direction in which they're pointing. So it's not that lots of self work adds up to organization work or lots of organization work adds up to institutional work. These are just different areas in which institutional work is done, and we found it useful to divide it up this way. Unfortunately, it looks like levels, but that's not our intention, right? Does that answer Sergio's question, Tom, or is there anything else we want to?
I think it significantly does. There's just probably one more piece to Sergio's question, which is the relationship for us between the kind of right-hand column, if you like, and the left-hand column. And so in some sense, they are nested in that way, but they're probably nested more analytically than anything else. And so when we looked at all the different kinds of work that were being studied, then we organized that work in terms of in relationship to the self, in relationship to organizations, in relationship to institutions. And so there is a sense in which if you look at organization work, then it does include strategy work and boundary work and technology work. And so there is a kind of overarchingness in the left-right direction, but as Nelson was saying, not in the kind of up and down direction.
Yeah, it's like organization work is met as a category of, and within it there's many kinds of work. So you can categorize different forms of organization work usefully into things like strategy work, boundary work, and technology work. So that's kind of the way those fit together. But it's not that self work somehow is below in some sort of sense. Okay. So if you have more questions about that, we can always come back to that later. Tom will be watching the chat, as I said. I like this picture. I think it's pretty incredible, really, when you think about what. So I have two questions for you. You can chat. You can put your answers in the chat. First one is, what is this? What's this a picture of? And second of all, and that's the perfect answer, Rodrigo, for my next question. So Rodrigo says Tesla. Yeah, this is a picture of a Tesla car in space. And if you look at this, yeah, Tesla in space, that's right. If you look at this, what kinds of organization work surround the production of this image? Tyson says it's a picture of ego, that's for sure. But that's self-work, right? What kind of organization work might have went into this? Yeah, boundary work for sure. This is, you know, this is extending the boundary. Uh, that's good. Technology work, yeah, for sure. Tons of technology work went into this. Organizational identity work, very good. Yeah, yeah, right. Lots of identity work. So this, in one way, this is an exercise in organizational identity work, but also, of course, going back to our topic last time we met, self work. There's tons of self work going on here, right? Because this has also got to do with Elon Musk. It's not an accident that this is actually Elon Musk's own car, the one he used to drive that he put into space, right? Which is a huge, great example of both organizational work, because there's stuff going on around Tesla. This is a Tesla car. It's got to do with his space, also with the space company, that the rockets. But it's a really interesting example. We can see that this picture itself is organizational identity work by Tesla, but also individual self level of the self. It's Elon Musk is also, it's got to do with his identity. So you got self work, you got organization work, and lots of kinds of organization work. Most obvious being the one we're going to talk about later with Paul, which is organization identity work. So it's a great example of how even in the, you know, these sort of pretty strange kind of situation, there's some studyable examples of social symbolic work have gone on around this. To produce this picture, and actually the production of this picture and the circulation of this picture is organizational identity work, along with lots of other boundary work and lots of other stuff. So good job on that. So it's getting us thinking about that. If we're thinking about social symbolic work and organization work as a kind of category of social symbolic work, then that requires, or we think about organizations as social symbolic objects, right? So I think that, you know, commonly the most simplest definition of an organization is just a couple people interacting and doing something purposefully with a shared goal of some sort. But in this case, what we're interested in is not so much the people, although they're important, but this sort of socially constructed thing, this thing that exists beyond the people who make it up, and even beyond the activities of the people who are the organization's members and stakeholders. But this sort of social idea of an organization, this pattern over time, is very interesting. One of the, I mean, organizations, you're organization theorists, many of you are organization theorists. It's really interesting to think a little bit about how organizations exist beyond, and you know, we have organizations that are much older than any human can ever be. They exist, people come, people go, and the organization carries on. Tom's University, Oxford University, is very, 700-800 years old. How does an organization exist for 800 years? What does that actually mean? Well, it exists as a social symbolic object. It exists as an idea. Right? So when we, in the book, when we started talking about this, that's for the first point. We're not interested so much in groups of people. We're interested in the idea that binds them together, the concept, the social construction, the patterns of activities. So it's not so much the people, it's the thing that we all talk about as the organization. And that's a really interesting social object, social symbolic object. Just like we had a conversation about the self, in the book we go into some detail about the development of this idea of an organization as something that's somehow separate from the people that make it up, right? If we go back to pre-modern times and what was going on, the word organization appeared in the 1700s. So before that, people didn't talk about organizations the way we do now. They didn't have this. They have this idea. The organization tended to be connected to an individual, the king or the queen, or the tribal leaders, or even the people. So in Rome, it was the citizens. Rome was the citizens were Rome, and the Caesar, of course. But this idea that the people, there was no sense of Rome separate from those people that made it up. And with the appearance of modernism, this whole thing that happened all across Europe, one of the things that happened is the idea of organizations as being separate from its members, as a thing of it, something that existed and later began to get all kinds of rights, to the point we are now, where, the freedom of speech is a right that organizations have in the United States, at least, which is really interesting. How does this thing have rights? Right? So this makes it such an interesting object to study. Right? I have a picture here of very, very nicely dressed gentleman from the Prussian army. And that's the example we used in the book to sort of talk about how this idea that an organization existed and it could be rationally constructed and then improved upon through the application of methods, which led to the development organization theory, thing that we study, and that sense of something that can be improved. Of course, more recently, we have this idea of a postmodern organization, and we spend a bit of time on that in the book, and the idea that really, there isn't one best way, that there's lots of different ways, and that actually Slack, creativity, playfulness have a role, and that organizations also are maybe not things, they're actually elements of broader ecosystems is becoming increasingly a way of looking at this, especially in entrepreneurship and in strategy. So this sort of what organizations are is shifting again, but we always still have, and I don't think we made the point when we talked about the self. It's not that the self is completely gone, the pre-modern kind of self, or the pre-modern kind of sense of a group of people can be an organization, even if it's just a group of people. That's still, that those kind of pre-modern organizations still exist in our society, and very modern organizations still exist. And then there's postmodern organizations. We see a mix of these things that occur, and it's important when you're thinking about social symbolic objects and organizations as social symbolic objects, which one it is that you're actually talking about. Okay? So again, this shift through modernism and postmodernism, the societal movement has created an object that can be managed and can be improved upon, and then some people deciding that actually there's limits to what you can do with that. It's very parallel to the conversation we had about the self.
Of course, there's lots and lots and lots of purposeful effort in organizations. That's not organization work. Organization work is separate from the practical work of doing things in organizations. So if people in an organization who are building cars on an assembly line, they're making cars, that's work. It's in an organization, but it's not what we would call organization work. If someone is then redesigning the assembly line and rethinking the organization's strategy, that's the organization work, because they're actually working on the organization. They're reorganizing the way people are deployed in the practical activities of the organization. That's organization work, right? But if you're actually doing the work, building the cars, then you're doing work, but it's not organization work. So it's about working on organizations, not working in them, right? So this is really important, because lots and lots and lots of work in organizations is practical work for practical ends. That's not about changing or fixing up the organization, right? Anything, Tom, you want to add? No? So this is very important separation. We're not saying then that everything that people do in organizations is organizational work. We're saying that things that people do in an organization to change the organization, shape the organization, or to maintain the organization as an object, that could be seen as organization work, but not actually creating, doing the practical work. And also, if you're creating a kind of organization, it's at the next level up. So, the B Corporation in the US, it's a new type of organization. All the work done by all the actors to create that new organization form, that's not organization work, that's institutional work. That's the one we're going to talk about later, right? And we're going to talk about, we'll talk about it's institutional work, that creating a new type of organization. If you're creating an actual B Corp, or making your organization into a B Corp, right, then that would be organization work. If you're actually, that's it. So these are, I think, quite clear lines, and just important to kind of get the idea, and I think it's quite helpful. Right? So if we're doing the practical work of organizations, making goods, providing services to our customers, making money, that's work, but it's not organization work. If we're doing work on the nature of the organization, restructuring it, changing it, fixing it, that's organization work. If we're actually creating a new kind of organization as a category of organization, that again is institutional work, right? So there's lots of work going on here, but only some of it is organization work. Again, who does it? Well, lots of people do it. So there can be lots of actors involved in this kind of stuff. We're not just looking at the leaders in the organization, although they're very important, but they're not the only ones who do this kind of work. We can be organizational members themselves. It's different, doesn't just have to be the leaders, We have, of course, lots of studies in organization theory about, how organizational members work together to change culture, or organizational members do other sorts of things that filter up. Henry Mintzberg talked about emergent strategy. Well, that's kind of organizational members contributing to the construction of the organization members. The organization. External actors have a huge impact, right? So a government can change a regulation, which causes lots of organizations to actually have to change how they do things. That government, in changing that regulation, is doing organization work. And there can be lots of other actors externally. Customers obviously can be involved. Supply chain, can be any sort of actor. What we're really looking at is that their efforts are changing an organization. Right? Very briefly, for like 5 minutes, just quickly to think a little bit about these two of the kind of areas that we talk about in the book. And this is strategy work first, and this is really such a great example of the kind of thinking that we're trying to draw together, because the strategy work has a very clear social symbolic object, which is a strategy, right? So strategy is the object, and then they're interested in all the things people do and how they do it to shape, build, create, launch strategies. So for us, this is a really great example of a literature that's focused on purposeful, reflexive efforts of actors, because when people are building a strategy, they're being very reflexive. They know what they're doing. They know they're building a strategy. They're purposely trying to build a strategy. There's lots of interaction, attempts to push things in one way, attempts to push things in the other way. If you've been involved in this process, it's a struggle to get to a strategy. And this whole literature on strategy work is a well-developed body of work from the kind of perspectives that we're trying to bring together in this X work kind of social science research. Okay, and the Studies Practice Scholarship is really an interesting example of what can be done in lots of other areas in terms of developing a coherent, well-developed understanding of what people use, what kind of objects, and the material sense. So there's papers in the Strategies Practice literature on things like the role of whiteboards and pens, the role of other space in this process, also then the role of people and how people communicate and how they interact. So it's a really great example for us of a literature that has a clear object and is interested in work done to construct and shape that object. Do you want to add anything, Tom? You're kind of a more of a strategies practice guy than me. All right.
No, that's great.
Okay. A second one is boundary work, and boundary work is, I find it personally quite interesting. I've tried to write something on it. Tom has succeeded. I've tried, just because boundaries are such a great example of a socially constructed. It's often very clear what's going on as people construct boundaries. There's boundaries in terms of organizations are multiple. There's multiple kinds of boundaries, right? There's legal boundaries, there's control boundaries, there's technology boundaries, there's lots of different kinds of boundaries. And that sort of sets of processes that place those boundaries at certain places and hold them in place are great examples of, a lot of it is boundary work. People are working hard especially when they're maintaining or changing them. So lawyers who go to court to argue that a legal boundary is in a particular location, right? Managers who try to expand their sphere of influence through various kinds of deals and things that they're doing purposely, knowing that what they're trying to do is get control of something, even though it's not maybe legally part of the organization. We want to, and this is, for example, platform strategy. Annabelle, I think Annabelle's here, platform strategy. There's lots of work being done by platform leaders to draw boundaries and get people inside those boundaries and to keep them in there, right? That's boundary work, lots of boundary work. And Annabelle and I wrote about that a bit, identity work around that. So this is another area, a bit, not nearly as developed as the strategy work, kind of the strategies practice literature looking at strategy as an object, but boundaries is another really, I think, quite easy to understand and see. This isn't an object, social symbolic object, and there's lots of actors who are trying to influence that. Right?
Just one quick point here is that this is one of those points in the seminar and in the book where we could have put boundary work in lots of places in the book. And there's a, if you know the boundary and boundary work literature, you know there are lots of kinds of boundaries, um, both conceptual and symbolic and also social. We focused on the idea of a social boundary with the organization, and we focused on organizational boundaries in particular, mostly as a way to make it possible to include it as a part of a book rather than a whole book. And so it's not that we're saying that the only boundaries that are interesting or of importance are organizational boundaries or even social boundaries, but they kind of relational, in the book we talk about relational work as a part of this, and I think that spills over into this. There's a really great annals paper coming out by Anne Langley and colleagues that talks about boundary work in real depth with different pieces, so you should take a look at that.
Yeah, I think if we wanted to be a little bit more correct in terms of this chapter and what we're talking about, we probably would put organization boundary work. Really, we just that was a bit, kind of hard to say and a bit of a mouthful and took up a lot of space in the book. But it would be correct because there's as Tom says, there's lots of other literatures and lots of other. In fact, much of social construction, in fact, all of it really is about boundaries, boundaries between categories. Saying what thing is what fits into what category, the practices of putting things into these categories. So really you have to decide what you're talking about in this case, and what we're talking about here, and where we're limiting our discussion is to organizational boundary work, but yeah, there's a number of different boundaries and things that can be studied from this perspective, and already are being studied from these perspectives that are sympathetic to the way we think about it. Again, this is another version of the picture that you saw that Tom talked about with the self. And in the book, we just argue that, this kind of social symbolic work, organization work, again, there's a bunch of things that we can study, and lots of interesting stuff is happening in the arrows, as Tom says, but it's really lots of interesting research questions about the practices that go into organization work. Where do they come from? How do they develop? We have a big, lots of discussions about that in the literature already, about practices inside organizations. Of course, it's practices at an inter-organizational level. That's a different conversation. That's not what we're talking about here. Resources. What resources do you need to do this? Motivations. Why do you want to do it? Right? And all all these situational aspects that shape people's desire and the way they approach and do this kind of organization work, right? And then of course the effects, and some of those effects are purposeful. Sometimes people get what they want to get. Sometimes they get partially what they want to get and have some unintended consequences. And sometimes what happens is the outcome is completely not what they anticipated or wanted, right? So unintended consequences are a really important part of the effects. So I think best case, you get what you want. Medium case, you don't get anything. And worst case, you get unintended consequences that suck. Right? And anyone who's tried to change anything in an organization will recognize that set of outcomes.